All right, get ready to dive deep because today we are tackling David Hume and his thoughts on cause and effect.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, it really
I
is.
love this.
So, to guide us on this deep dive, we have Helen Beebe's Hume on Causation. It's from the book Problems of Philosophy.
Which is a great collection of kind of entry points
Yeah,
to a lot of the big philosophical questions.
for sure.
And yeah, human causation, it's a fun one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea of cause and effect, it just seems so basic, right?
Right. Like, how could that possibly be a difficult thing?
Yeah, like I touch a hot stove, I get burned.
Right.
Like that's just how the world works.
Yeah. It's kind of like intuitive and built into the way we think about everything.
Yeah. So let's find out why Hume decided to poke at this idea of cause and effect and kind of try to like figure out what's really going on there.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things that's so interesting about Hume, right? He's really trying to do this kind of science of man. He wants to know, okay, how is it that we come to have the ideas and beliefs that we do?
Mm.
How do our minds actually work?
Yeah.
And so back in Hume's day, a lot of philosophers thought that we had this sort of special insight into the nature of reality.
Okay.
So they had this view called the insight ideal.
Mm.
And the idea there is that, somehow we're able to grasp the essences of things.
It's like the essence of fire and the essence of heat.
Exactly. So we just see that, oh, fire has this essential nature, heat has this essential nature, and those essences are such that fire must produce heat.
Okay, so it's like we're all walking around with this secret, like, decoder ring for the universe, and we just know how things work.
Right. We've got this special access to the inner workings of things.
Yeah. I gotta say, that's not really jiving with my daily experience.
Right. I don't think Hume felt that way either.
Okay.
And so Hume, as an empiricist, he's really skeptical of any claim like that we've got this special insight. And so he really wants to push back on that view and see if there's actually any good empirical evidence for thinking that we have this kind of insight.
Okay, so spoiler alert, he
I'm s-
probably doesn't find the evidence right.
You got it.
Okay.
He's really going to turn this whole idea on its head. He's going to say, no, we don't have this special sort of God-given insight into the nature of reality or, the nature of fire and heat and all that.
Okay.
What we have is experience.
Okay, so he's saying we learn about cause and effect the same way we learn any other piece of information about the world, just through experiencing it, through our senses.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in fact, he even compares the way that we understand causation to the way that animals learn.
Really? Okay, now I'm intrigued.
So he says, think about a dog who's learned that when you grab the leash, it's time to go for a walk.
Yeah.
They've learned to associate that one event with the other just through repeated observation.
Okay, so he's saying just like a dog learns to associate leash equals walkies, we learn to associate fire equals hot or, whatever cause and effect relationship we're observing.
That's right.
Okay.
And so for Hume, it's not about this kind of deep, intuitive grasp of the essences of things.
Okay.
It's about recognizing patterns.
Okay, so we're like pattern-seeking creatures, just like animals, just looking for those regularities in the world.
Right.
And then we build our understanding of cause and effect based on those patterns.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And so Hume really wants to figure out, okay, what's going on in our minds
Yeah.
when we're recognizing these patterns and coming to believe that one thing causes another.
Okay.
And one of the tools that he uses to try to figure this out is something called Hume's fork.
Okay, Hume's fork. Is that like a literal fork or is this a philosophical tool?
Philosophical tool.
Okay, good. Because I was a little worried about sharp objects being involved.
No. So Hume's fork is basically a way of dividing up all of our knowledge into two categories.
Mm-hmm.
And those two categories are relations of ideas and matters of fact.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit. What exactly are relations of ideas?
Yeah, so relations of ideas are things that we know through pure reason, like math.
Okay, so like 2 + 2 = 4.
Exactly. And those are true by definition.
Okay.
Whereas matters of fact are things that we know from experience.
Okay, so like the fact that the sun rises in the east.
Right.
Okay, so Hume's fork is basically a way of saying, okay, there are things we know just by thinking about them, and then there are things we know by going out and experiencing the world.
Exactly.
And so he's basically trying to decide, okay, where does cause and effect fit into this fork?
Right. Where does it fall?
Yeah.
And he decides that cause and effect is a matter of fact.
Okay, so it's not something we just know intuitively, it's something we learn from observing the world.
Right. It belongs in that category of things that we learn through experience.
Okay, now that has some pretty interesting implications, I think, because if cause and effect is something we learn from experience, it kind of implies that it's not some absolute unchangeable truth out there in the universe,
Right.
right?
Exactly. It's not something that's just sort of built into the fabric of reality.
Okay, so that's already kind of blowing my mind a little bit, but let's keep going.
Yeah.
So, if cause and effect is a matter of fact, how does Hume explain how we come to understand these connections, these cause and effect relationships?
Yeah. So this is where it gets really fun.
Okay, I like fun.
Hume, as an empiricist, really wants to trace our ideas back to their roots in our senses.
Okay.
He thinks that every idea we have ultimately has to come from some kind of sensory experience,
Okay.
or, as he calls it, an impression.
Okay, so impression, meaning like a sensory input, something that we've seen, heard, touched, tasted, smelled, something like that.
That's right, exactly.
Right.
And so Hume goes on a quest, essentially. He wants to find the impression that gives rise to our idea of necessary connection.
Okay, necessary connection. So
Yeah.
that's the feeling that we get that one event like must follow another event.
That's right. There's this kind of inevitability to it.
Okay.
And he wants to find the sensory experience that leads to that idea.
So he's like a detective searching for clues in the world of our senses.
That's a great way to put it. He's looking for the root, the origin of this feeling of mustness that we associate with cause and effect relationships.
Does he find it? What's the verdict? Did he crack the case?
Oh,
Uh-oh. That doesn't sound promising.
it's a cliffhanger. So no, he doesn't find it.
What?
Yeah, he comes up empty-handed.
Oh, man. So what does that mean?
Yeah, that's the really interesting part, right?
Yeah.
So he argues that no matter how closely we examine cause and effect events themselves, we can't find any impression
Okay.
that corresponds to this idea of a necessary connection.
Okay, so give me an example. Like if I'm watching one billiard ball hit another, what am I seeing and what am I not seeing?
Right, so you see one ball move toward the other ball,
Mhm.
you see them collide,
Yeah.
and you see the second ball move.
Yeah.
But you don't see anything that suggests that the first ball had to make the second ball move.
Okay, so there's no like little invisible string connecting them
Right.
that forces the second ball to move.
Yeah, there's no little, like, magical force or anything like that.
Okay, so if we're not seeing this necessary connection out there in the world, where is it coming from?
Yeah, that's the big question, right?
Yeah.
And Hume says, essentially, it's coming from us.
Okay, so it's not objective, it's subjective.
Right. It's a product of our minds.
Okay, how so? How are we creating this sense of necessary connection if it's not really out there?
Right. So he says that this idea of necessary connection, it comes from the feeling of expectation
Okay.
that we develop when we observe the same kind of events happening over and over again.
Okay.
So we see that, every time we flip the light switch, the light goes on.
Yeah.
And eventually we just start to expect that when we flip the switch, the light will go on.
Right.
And that feeling of expectation, that's what gives rise to this idea that there's a necessary connection.
Okay, so it's not that we're seeing this mustness out there in the world. It's that we're feeling it internally based on our past experiences.
Exactly.
It's like our minds are creating this illusion of necessity.
That's right. And it's a very powerful illusion.
Yeah, because I mean, we really do feel like certain events must follow other events.
Yeah.
It's not like we're consciously choosing to believe in cause and effect. It's just like an automatic response,
Right. It's something that's so ingrained in the way we think about the world
Right.
that it's hard to even imagine thinking about it any other way.
Okay, so Hume is basically saying that this feeling of mustness is coming from inside us, not from the world itself. But then this is where it gets even more interesting, because Beebee points out that even though Hume says that, he also seems to think that we genuinely experience events as causally connected. Hold on, didn't we just establish that the connection is coming from inside us? Now we're saying we experience it as if it's real out there in the world. How can it be both?
Yeah. So this is a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
But the way to think about it is that Hume is introducing this idea of what we now call phenomenal projection.
Okay, phenomenal projection. That sounds intense. Break that down for me.
So the idea is that sometimes our internal feelings and expectations and all that, they can actually project outward and influence how we perceive the world.
Okay, so it's like, if I'm already feeling anxious, I'm more likely to interpret a neutral event as a threat. Like my internal state is coloring my perception of the situation.
That's a great example.
Okay.
So Hume thinks something similar is going on with causation.
Okay, I'm listening.
We have this feeling of expectation, right, that one event will follow another.
Yeah, based on our past observations.
Exactly. And that feeling actually gets projected onto the events themselves.
Okay.
And it makes it seem as though there's this real objective, necessary connection between them.
So it's like we're taking our subjective feeling and we're almost like superimposing it on the world.
Right, so you're adding this extra layer of meaning onto the events.
Okay, so it's both. The connection is both in our heads and also something we experience as real. It's a pretty mind-bending concept.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
But that's Hume for you.
Oh, always got to keep us on our toes. Okay, so how does this idea of phenomenal projection help us understand Hume's overall theory of causation?
Yeah. So it actually helps to explain why Hume ends up giving us two definitions of cause.
Wait, two? I thought we were struggling to find even one.
Right. Well, he's tricky like that.
Yeah, I'm starting to see a pattern here.
So one definition is in terms of the constant conjunction of events.
Okay.
So event A always follows event B, and that's how we come to see A as the cause of B.
Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. It's just about observing patterns in the world.
Right.
What's the other definition?
Yeah, so the other definition is a little bit more complex. It says that a cause is an object followed by another, where the mind is compelled to move from the idea of the first to the idea of the second.
Okay, so that one's definitely a bit more mental, a bit more about what's going on inside our heads.
Right.
And how do these two definitions fit together? Are they both equally valid?
Well, that's where the debate comes in.
Okay, here we go again, back into the philosophical ring.
Right.
So what are the different interpretations of these two definitions?
Yeah, so some people think that Hume's trying to give us kind of a complete definition of causation
Okay.
by combining these two aspects.
Okay.
But others, like Beebee, they think that the definitions are actually pointing to different aspects of causation.
Okay, so they're not two parts of a whole. They're more like two sides of the same coin.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
So we've got this objective side.
The constant conjunction,
Right. We've got the subjective side.
the mental compulsion. And they both contribute to our understanding of what cause and effect is all about.
Exactly. And that leads us to two main interpretations of Hume's work on causation.
Okay, now this is what I've been waiting for. This is where things really get interesting.
Okay. Yes.
So what are these two interpretations?
We've got projectivism and skeptical realism.
Ooh, sounds like we've got a philosophical showdown brewing.
Yeah. Let's get ready to rumble.
Okay, so round three, projectivism versus skeptical realism. Which one is going to come out on top?
Well, let's start by getting to know our contenders a little better. In this corner, representing the idea that our minds play a big role in shaping how we experience causation, we have projectivism.
Okay, so for the projectivists, is it all about our minds kind of creating this idea of cause and effect and then projecting it onto the world?
That's a good way to put it, yeah. They really emphasize the role of phenomenal projection.
Okay, and remind me what phenomenal projection is again.
So it's the idea that our internal feelings, expectations, all that stuff, it can actually influence how we perceive the world.
Okay, like that example we talked about, where if I'm already anxious, I might interpret a neutral event as a threat.
Exactly.
My feelings are kind of coloring how I see things.
Right, and so projectivists say that something similar is happening with causation.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, we see these constant conjunctions of events, right? Like A happens, then B happens over and over.
Yeah, like I drop my phone, it cracks.
Right, exactly.
And so my mind, being the pattern-seeking machine that it is, starts to create this feeling of like, oh, those two events are connected.
Right, and then we project that feeling of connection onto the events themselves.
So it's not that projectivists think cause and effect is totally made up, right? It's more like our experience of it is deeply shaped by how our minds work.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Okay, so what are some of the strengths of projectivism? What makes it a compelling interpretation of Hume?
Well, one thing it does really well is it explains how we distinguish between genuine causal relationships and just mere coincidences.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, why do we say that flicking a light switch causes the light to turn on, but we don't say that wearing my lucky socks causes my team to win?
Right. So projectivists would say that it comes down to the strength of our projection.
Okay, so if I have a really strong feeling of mustness, if it just seems super obvious that those two events are linked, then I'm more likely to say it's a causal relationship.
Exactly.
But if it just seems like a fluke, a coincidence, then I'm not going to project that same feeling of necessity onto it.
Right. So it's not just about passively observing patterns.
It's about making judgments, deciding which patterns seem like they really matter.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's pretty cool. But I imagine projectivism has its critics too, right?
Oh, for sure. There are definitely some challenges that projectivists have to address.
Like what?
Well, one big one is that it can make our causal judgment seem kind of arbitrary.
Okay, so like if it all comes down to how I feel about a certain connection, how can we ever agree on what causes what?
Right. And that's a big concern for science, which is all about trying to find objective truths about the world.
Yeah, because if everyone's just projecting their own subjective feelings onto things, how can we ever build a shared body of knowledge?
Right. And that's something projectivists have to grapple with.
Okay, so how do they respond to that criticism?
Well, they emphasize that even though our initial projections might be based on our personal experiences, we're constantly testing those projections against the world.
Okay, so it's like a back and forth process.
Exactly.
I project my expectations onto the world, then I see what happens, and then I adjust my projections accordingly.
Right. So it's not just about clinging to our initial hunches.
It's about being open to revising our beliefs as we gather more evidence.
Exactly. And projectivists would say that this ongoing process of testing and revising is what ultimately allows us to arrive at shared understandings of cause and effect.
Okay, that makes sense. So projectivism definitely has some interesting things to say about Hume's work. But what about the other contender, skeptical realism? What's their take on all of this?
So skeptical realists, they're a little bit more open to the idea that there might be something real out there in the world, some hidden structure that's driving the events we observe.
Okay, so they're not denying the role of the mind, but they're also not saying it's all in our heads.
Exactly.
They're saying, yeah, we might be projecting our expectations and stuff, but there might also be something real that we're responding to.
Right, like maybe there's a deeper level of reality that we're not fully grasping.
Okay, I can see how that would be appealing. It kind of preserves the idea that the world exists independently of us.
Yeah, and that our knowledge is about something real, not just something we've made up.
Okay, so what are some of the challenges that skeptical realists face?
Well, one big one is explaining why we rely so much on custom and habit, if there's really this objective causal structure out there.
Yeah, like why wouldn't we be able to just perceive it directly? Why do we have to go through all this trial and error, this pattern seeking?
Right, and that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
Some skeptical realists say that maybe custom and habit are kind of like a shortcut, a way for us to navigate the causal terrain without having to fully understand the underlying mechanisms.
Okay, so we've evolved to be good at spotting patterns and making predictions, even if we don't know exactly how everything works behind the scenes.
That's one way to think about it.
But isn't there another challenge too? Like, if we've never directly experienced these hidden powers, these secret mechanisms of causation, how can we even form the idea of them?
That's right, that's another big one.
Didn't Hume say that all our ideas have to come from impressions, from sensory experiences?
He did.
So if we've never sensed these secret powers, how can they even be in our minds?
Right, and so skeptical realists have to explain how we can have this idea of something that we've never directly encountered.
Okay, so how do they do that?
Well, they appeal to inference.
Okay, inference meaning we're kind of drawing a conclusion based on other evidence.
Exactly.
So we see the patterns, we see the regularities in the world, and we infer that there must be some hidden cause, some underlying structure, even if we can't see it directly.
That's right.
So it's like saying, I can't see the wind, but I can see the trees swaying, so I infer that the wind must be blowing.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so skeptical realism is kind of like saying that our causal inferences are pointing us toward a deeper level of reality.
Yeah, even if that reality is always going to be partially hidden from us.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. So we've got these two interpretations of Hume's work, projectivism and skeptical realism, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Which one is right?
Well, that's $1 million question,
Yeah.
and there's no easy answer.
So Hume leaves us with a bit of a mystery.
He does, but I think that's part of what makes his work so fascinating.
Yeah, he gives us these really powerful tools for thinking about causation, but he also leaves us with some really deep questions to ponder,
Right, he doesn't give us all the answers.
which is probably a good thing.
Yeah, it keeps us thinking.
So for our listeners who've been with us on this deep dive into Hume's world, what are the big takeaways? What do we want them to remember?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that Hume really challenges this idea that we have this, like, direct, unmediated access to the world.
Right, he's saying we're not just passive observers, we're actively shaping how we understand things.
Exactly. And that applies to causation, too.
It's not just something out there waiting for us to discover it.
It's something we're actively constructing through our experiences, our expectations, our habits.
And our projections.
Right.
So it's a collaborative effort between our minds and the world.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And I think another big takeaway is that Hume leaves us with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Definitely.
He reminds us that we can't be absolutely certain about anything, especially when it comes to cause and effect.
Right. The problem of induction is always lurking in the background.
Exactly. Just because something has happened a certain way in the past doesn't guarantee that it will always happen that way in the future.
Right. And that's a good thing to keep in mind, I think.
Or it keeps us humble.
Yeah. Keeps us open to new possibilities, new ways of understanding the world.
And on that note, we'll leave you, dear listener, with a final thought to ponder. Hume suggests that the mustness of causation might always remain a mystery, a hidden mechanism beyond our grasp. Does this change how you view the world? Does it matter if we can never fully understand the deep underlying nature of cause and effect? Or is our ability to predict and control events enough? Food for thought.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
And from all of us here at The Deep Dive, thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey into the world of David Hume and the mysteries of causation.